The year is 1978, and we find ourselves in the city of Rome, Italy, where the world awaits the results of the first conclave of the year. First, you might ask. Well, allow me to explain. Following the death of Pope Paul VI in early August of that same year, Cardinal Albino Luciani, the Patriarch of Venice, was among the strongest contenders for the papacy. In fact, the then Dean of the College of Cardinals, Carlo Confalonieri, was first to suggest Luciani for the papal position. On August 26th, Luciani became Pope John Paul I, the first pontiff in history to have two names. Just 33 days later, John Paul I was found dead in his bed. Although his official cause of death was ruled as a heart attack, many believe the death of John Paul I was a result of his vast knowledge about the corruption in the Vatican Bank. To avoid unfavorable information coming from the head of the Catholic Church, Luciani was taken care of to the best of the bank's abilities. You're watching The Dig, and this is the story of the September Pope. Born on October 17, 1912, Luciani was the first pope born in the 20th century and the last one to die in it. Ordained a priest in early July of 1935, Luciani was often described as lovely and lively, with other priests appreciating his good sense of humor. As a simple man who wished for a more open church that would attract a greater number of believers, Luciani published a book titled Catechesis and Crumbs in 1949, which aimed to teach the, quote, truths of the faith, end quote, in ways to make them comprehensible to everyone. By late 1958, he was already a bishop of Vittorio Veneto, a town in the Veneto region of Italy, appointed by Pope John XXIII. The title of Patriarch of Venice was bestowed upon him in December of 1969 and was kept by Luciani until his death in 1978. Known for his work in third world countries, Luciani publicly suggested that dioceses in well-developed and industrialized countries of the West renounce 1% of all their income in favor of the less fortunate countries of the third world to, quote, compensate for all the injustices that our consumer-oriented world is committing towards the world on the way to development, end quote. On March 5, 1973, Luciani was created a cardinal by Pope Paul VI. During his cardinalate, Luciani frequently traveled, but among his most significant visits is the visit to Sister Lucia dos Santos, the only surviving witness of the 1917 apparitions of the Virgin Mary in Fatima. Upon meeting him, Sister Lucia referred to Luciani as Holy Father, which caught the cardinal off guard. According to one of many conspiracy theories regarding his death, the bishop dressed in white, one of the three apocalyptic visions witnessed by Sister Lucia and her cousins Jacinta and Francisco Marto, represents the untimely death of John Paul I. Following his papal election in August of 1978, John Paul I initially considered declining the papacy, but ultimately accepted, saying to the College of Cardinals, quote, "May God forgive you for what you have done," end quote. Cardinal Jaime Lasiciasin of the Philippines was sure that Luciani would become the next pope, even telling him so during the conclave. According to writer Leo Knowles in his 2003 book titled Modern Heroes of the Church, John Paul I was present when, following his election, he said to Cardinal Sin, quote, "You are a prophet, but my reign will be a short one," end quote. John Paul I's beaming smile and cheery demeanor immediately struck a chord with the public that excitedly awaited his first appearance on the central balcony of St. Peter's Basilica. In fact, His short papacy is primarily remembered for his outward happiness and his warmth, best seen through his relationships with sisters he admitted into his apartment for morning mass. According to Sister Margherita Marin, the Pope spoke to Venetian sisters in Venetian dialect to make them feel more comfortable, and he'd oftentimes joke with them, especially when commenting his pictures in the newspapers. Upon his beatification in 2022, Pope Francis said of the smiling Pope, as he was known, that, quote, "With a smile, Pope John Paul I managed to communicate the goodness of the Lord," end quote. His August 27, 1978 Angelus, a Catholic devotion commemorating the incarnation of Christ, attracted a large number of people who were drawn to his natural friendliness and distinctive moral theology, based on kindness over severity, individual conscience, and gentle self-awareness. In comparison to the previous two popes, the theology of the September Pope, as he was also known, can be described as pastoral instead of diplomatic. With all that being said, I think it's time we get to the real meat and potatoes, guys. The death of John Paul I has become one of the most theorized papal deaths in contemporary history of the Church. There are many inconsistencies as to the details leading up to, around the time of his death, and following the discovery of the Pope's body, which fueled a lot of speculation. Let's get into them, shall we? The official story of the Pope's death goes like this. John Paul I went to bed distraught after learning that a group of neo-fascists began firing upon a group of people reading L'Unità, an Italian communist newspaper, outside one of the party's offices in Rome. One boy died and another one was seriously wounded. On September 29, 1978, the Pope was found pulseless in his bed by Sister Vicenza Taffarel and Sister Margherita Marin. When Sister Taffarel noticed the Pope hasn't had his coffee that she left for him in the sacristy, she went into the Pope's bedroom. At first, she thought the Pope was pulling a joke on her by acting unresponsive because she herself had heart problems, but once she touched the Pope's hand, she realized he had died. According to the two, he had Thomas à Kempis's book, The Imitation of Christ, next to him, and the bedside lamp was still on. As stated by Cardinal Secretary of State Pietro Parolin, John Paul I lamented of severe chest pains sometime after 7:30 p.m. on the evening of his death. Although the Pope's secretaries were worried, the Pope refused to see Dr. Renato Buzzonetti that night. Following the embalmment of John Paul I, Dr. Buzzonetti asserted the Pope had died of a heart attack on the night of the 28th of September. Buzzonetti claimed the pain the Pope suffered the night of his death came from the upper part of the sternal region. Okay, we finally got to the fun part. I already mentioned the bishop dressed in white theory, which ties to the visions witnessed by Sister Lucia and her cousins. However, the most popular theory by far is the Banco Ambrosiano theory. It began taking off following the publication of David Yallop's 1984 book titled In God's Name. The book explores the Pope's death in depth and ultimately comes to the conclusion that John Paul I was likely in danger due to the corruption in the Istituto per le Opere di Religione, Institute of Religious Works, aka the Vatican Bank. But first, we need to understand how the Vatican Bank ties to the Banco Ambrosiano. Established in 1896 by a Catholic lawyer, Banco Ambrosiano served as a Catholic bank to counterbalance Italy's Jewish banks. Since the beginning of the 20th century, Banco Ambrosiano was known as the priest's bank, even more so after Franco Ratti, nephew to Pope Pius XI, became the chairman. By the 1970s, Banco Ambrosiano began involving the Vatican Bank in their dealings, with the latter ultimately becoming the bank's main shareholder. Roberto Calvi, the bank's chairman from 1975 onwards, known as God's banker, was a shady guy. Beginning in the mid-1970s, Calvi began funneling money through a network of shell companies in tax havens like Panama and Luxembourg. Because these companies took out massive loans which were never properly backed or recorded, billions of dollars disappeared from the bank's books, resulting in Banco Ambrosiano missing over $1 billion in its account. The Vatican Bank was well aware of Banco's shady dealings, and there are speculations that both were closely involved with the Italian Mafia, especially in regard to money laundering. Calvi's connection to Propaganda 2, a clandestine Masonic lodge involved in political manipulation, corruption, and criminal networks, has also been scrutinized since the death of John Paul I. According to Yallop in his 1984 book, Calvi and the Propaganda 2 were likely responsible for the Pope's death. The Pope had announced a reform of Vatican finances shortly after his election, and, as stated by Yallop, knowing the higher-ups in the Vatican alongside the Pope were aware of Banco Ambrosiano's questionable dealings, Calvi and his mafia friends helped take the Pope out. According to both Yallop and theologian Abe George the Nant, John Paul I discovered a number of Mason priests in the Vatican in the days prior to his death. In fact, Yallop writes in his 2012 book titled The Power and the Glory, Inside the Dark Heart of John Paul II's Vatican, that the Pope advised then Cardinal Secretary of State Jean-Marie Vallot with personal transfers. Yallop goes as far as to name Paul Marcinkus, head of the Vatican Bank, Vallot, and John Cody, Archbishop of Chicago, as main suspects alongside Calvi, Michele Sindona, banker for the Sicilian Mafia and the Vatican, and Licio Gelli, head of the Propaganda 2. Yallop states the following, quote, "It was clear that these 6 men had a great deal to fear if the papacy of John Paul I should continue. All of them stood to gain in a variety of ways if John Paul I should suddenly die." End quote. Another popular theory is that the Pope was assassinated to prevent the restoration of the Tridentine Mass, the traditional form of the Roman Catholic Mass standardized after the Council of Trent between 1545 and 1563. What differentiates the Tridentine Mass from the quote-unquote standard one is that the entire Mass is celebrated in Latin, the priest faces the altar, the Mass follows a very precise structure, large portions are said silently or in a low voice, and Gregorian chants are usually sung. In 2013, the Catholic traditionalist movement claimed their founder, Father Gomar de Pau, went to Rome to help the Pope reinstate the Tridentine Mass. Following Vatican II, between 1962 and 1965, the Church introduced the Novus Ordo, a new form of Mass which moved away significantly from the Tridentine Mass. The traditionalists were less than satisfied with such a decision, resulting in sympathy from John Paul I, who planned on reinstating the Tridentine Mass during his papacy. In 2017, Father Charles Murr, a Catholic priest, author, and receiver of the 10 Outstanding Young Persons in the World and the 10 Outstanding Young Americans in 1985, wrote a book titled The Godmother, Madre Pascalina, in which he exposes the case of Cardinal Sebastiano Baggio, an alleged Freemason within the Church. According to Murr, Baggio was responsible for appointing a number of progressive/modern prelates that, quote, enable the wreckage we've seen in recent decades, end quote, during his 11-year tenure as prefect of the Congregation for Bishops. Murr explains, quote, Baggio high-handedly appointed the world's bishops for those extremely crucial post-Vatican Council 2 years. He made certain that the new breed of bishops was, in a word, liberal, end quote. Baggio was also responsible for appointing ex-Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, who was defrocked in 2019 after being convicted of sexual misconduct in a canonical trial. Pope Paul VI failed to deal with Baggio and his overwhelming influence within the Vatican since 1973, so John Paul I tried to take care of the problem. Murr establishes that Baggio was the last person to see the Pope before his death, coming to see John Paul I at around 8 o'clock. Allegedly, screaming and harsh words were heard from the papal apartments. Following his visit, Baggio was removed from the Congregation for Bishops. John Paul I died later that night. Anthony Raimondi's 2019 book titled When the Bullet Hits the Bone presents yet another theory about the Pope's death. Raimondi, a Colombo gangster who also claims to be the nephew of Lucky Luciano, the father of the Italian Mafia, and the first official boss of the modern Genovese crime family, recounts helping his cousin Archbishop Paul Marcinkus kill Pope John Paul I. Raimondi claims his job was to learn the Pope's habits, while Marcinkus was charged with putting Valium in the Pope's tea to knock him out before poisoning him with cyanide. In Raimondi's words, quote, "I done a lot of things in my time, but I didn't want to be there in the room when they killed the Pope. I knew that would buy me a one-way ticket to hell," end quote. Instead, Raimondi was lookout while Marcinkus did the actual dirty work. The Colombo gangster backs Yallop's statements that the Pope had been killed because he, quote, threatened to expose a massive stock fraud run by the Vatican insiders, end quote. As is the case with most unexpected and somewhat inexplicable occurrences, conspiracy theories about the September Pope still generate a lot of speculation and interest. A relatively young man dies at 65 years old, with no previous medical concerns, besides chest pain the night before, and the Vatican refuses to perform an autopsy on the Pope's body due to the idea that a person's body should be treated with reverence even after death. I think it shocks no one that people to this day question the cause of death of John Paul I. It's likely we'll never know what really happened, but diving deep into potential explanations of an event that has been baffling people for over 47 years is both fun and informative, because it shows the depth of distrust people have towards authorities. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more niche and weird history topics that are yet to be covered. Until next time, diggers.